Hi everybody and welcome to the CERIAS Security Seminar. It's my great pleasure today to welcome Steve Surdu and Dan McCord from Mandiant, and they are here to talk about finding evil and solving crime.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Steve Surdu, everybody. I'm the Vice President of Professional Services at Mandiant Corporation, and I have a confession to make. I'm actually a University of Michigan graduate. Sorry. Although the last couple of years you guys have been pretty happy when the football teams come into town, so maybe no more apologies required. With me is Dan McWhorter. Dan?
I'm a managing director in the professional services side of our organization. You want to give backgrounds a little bit?
Do a little bit.
Cool. Now?
Yeah, no.
I'm a mathematician by schooling, and then I went up to the National Security Agency. I worked there for a few years in their cryptologic mathematics program, and went over to work for Mantech International, and then I'm in about 5 years now that I've been at Mandiant Corporation. And while there, I've done a lot of pretty interesting stuff, running engagements and incident response. And also I help head up our professional training group. So that's my background.
I'm not nearly as smart as Dan. I hire smart people. I'm the guy who's got the overall responsibility for the consulting practice. I'll tell you just a little bit about it. But my background, my pedigree is I came out of the University of Michigan and worked at what's now Accenture, but was Anderson Consulting back in the day, and where I got most of my formative training. For the last 13 years, I've been involved with security of one form or another, either at Foundstone, at Mandiant Corporation, or prior to that, BBN Technologies, which was the company that had the original contract with the DoD for the ARPANET development. Interesting people to work with there. What we're going to do today is not talk very much about Mandiant at all. But for those of you who don't have any idea who Mandiant is, we're an information security company. Primarily, we've done consulting work since 2004. We are involved with incident response, litigation support, what we call proactive services, and education. I have responsibility for the whole services side. We also have a product and managed services area, but not really going to go into great detail on anything other than incident response today. What we specialize in is enterprise-wide investigations. Enterprise-wide means big, meaning hundreds of thousands of nodes, and meaning compromised systems in the dozens, the hundreds, or the thousands, things that you just can't do manually. We think it's pretty interesting work. We primarily focus on financial crime and nation-state attacks, national security events. We spend the vast majority of our time with those. We're in DC, LA, New York City, and San Francisco. Okay, we're not going to talk about internet dating. There are threats out there. This is not one we will discuss today, but you never know what you're going to get, okay? So bad things can happen. Luckily, this doesn't happen to our clients, but we'll talk to you about the things that do. We're going to go through, talk about some of the major threats that our clients face. We're going to move from there to talk about who's behind them, what the different major groups are or individuals. We have some pictures, but not very many. And we have none of the underwear pictures, which is a good thing. The Russians are into that. We're going to talk about a few investigations to give you a sense for what it's like. We're going to talk a bit about, just at the very end, how we actually do it. But we're not going to spend a lot of time there because it's fairly involved and we want to just give you the high-level picture. We say questions and answers at the end, but if you do have questions as we go along, please ask. It works a whole lot better if you do it in context as we're moving through it, so don't be shy. Okay, so with that, the threats. There are three major categories of things we deal with. And the first one is financial loss, which everybody's heard about. You know, it's a credit card breach, it's a retailer, it's a bank, somebody who's lost credit cards, and that's very common, but it's actually less common now than some of the other things that we've seen more recently. What we're seeing more recently are big drawdowns from ATMs. That's drawdowns meaning they're pile driving the cash out with basically a valid set of credentials. ACH, or automated clearinghouse, electronic funds transfers, that's when somebody takes your balance in your bank and they move it to their balance in their bank. And if they're really good at it, they can get your credentials and they can move it through an electronic funds transfer. And they don't do it to you, they do it to corporations who have millions or hundreds of millions of dollars. And the largest known compromise of that nature is $600 million with one transaction. Pretty big stuff. The area that we spend most of the time in is the national security area. These are threats not for financial gain. These people are not about making money. They're about stealing knowledge. And this is nation states. This is foreign countries who have an interest in our intellectual property, our R&D, our weapons systems, what we're doing with mergers and acquisitions. When I say we, I'm talking about not just the United States government. Actually, it's largely corporate America that they spend most of their time. The military is a target. U.S. government civilian agencies are targets, but primarily they focus on commercial America. They even go after political parties where they want to know what the next administration is thinking. They want to know what they're going to be investing in. They want to be able to get out ahead of the curve. They do it for a lot of different reasons.
This landscape here has changed significantly over the last several years. Primarily 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, it was so, Department of Defense focused, national intelligence. And now the victims are very widespread, from law firms to manufacturers to corporations. If you have a secret sauce that another country can pick up the formula for and give themselves an economic advantage, you're a target.
One caveat, the last item there talks about energy. We actually don't see it. You'll hear in the press people talking about the grid. They're going to get information from the grid. They're going to bring the grid down. We don't see it. There's separation. There's physical separation to a large degree between the infrastructure that actually supports the grid and the administrative systems that these guys are dealing with. That is integrating. I think the risk goes up as time goes on, but to date, it's hypothetical. We have done SCADA not investigations, we've done SCADA vulnerability assessments, and the grid is absolutely vulnerable to attack, but it doesn't appear that there's any of that activity actually going on. Christina?
So I have a question. I had a question because you mentioned that corporate America is the target, but are those kind of attacks coming on also only from other nations, or it's also other corporations? Because the secret sauce, right, may be more beneficial to another sauce making.
In relatively rare occasions, we do see corporate espionage, but not nearly at the level that you would see it for nation states. The state-sponsored activity dwarfs anything that we see on a corporate espionage standpoint. There was a relatively high-profile case, Oracle versus SAP, that was just settled earlier this year, where Oracle was awarded $1.3 billion because SAP infiltrated their infrastructure, and we did the expert witness testimony for Oracle on that one. That's highly unusual in our experience. Does occur relatively infrequently. The third area is more of a potpourri. It's kind of a grab bag of other things beyond the nation state, beyond the financial crimes. It's individuals. It's disgruntled employees. It's the rogue individual. It's the hacktivists, the lulsecs and the anonymous. It's the people who are doing distributed denial of service attacks on gambling companies 2 weeks before the Super Bowl to take them down and extort them for money. It's not nearly as frequent. In our experience, we don't work with these types of situations very often. We occasionally do, but whereas on any day, we're probably involved with 5 to 10 nation-state attacks. I mean, today, we're working a whole bunch of cases concurrently because they happen all the time. We'll do one of these maybe once every 4 or 5 months, something like that. But anyway, those are the 3 different major areas of threats to the organizations that we support. The people or groups who are behind this, there are some people that we deal with and some that we don't. We're going to talk to you about, briefly, the rogue disgruntled employee type. And it's former IT people. For those of you going into IT, it's never the HR person, it's never corporate communications, it's the IT person who gets a chip on their shoulder and they go wild and do something bad.
Don't take their stapler.
Yeah, be careful. The hacktivist organizations, which are definitely a step up. Organized crime, which is Eastern European organized crime. That's where it emanates from primarily because of the lack of U.S. reciprocity laws with law enforcement.
That's almost always, that organized crime is almost always that financial aspect, those ACH transfers, the credit cards, the drawdowns, that tends to come out of that organized crime category.
We'll talk about the nation state attackers and how they're different from everything else, because they are much more advanced. What we don't do, these things do occur, but we don't happen to get involved with it, is we don't get involved with OJ cases. We don't get involved with the high profile capital crime stuff. We don't deal in human trafficking, although that does happen much more frequently in areas outside the United States. It's not as frequent here. We don't get involved. And we don't get involved with terrorists. The government does some things, but the terrorists primarily are using the internet for fundraising and for propaganda and for communication channels. But they're not trying to blow stuff up through the internet. It just isn't what they do. Okay, so let's talk about briefly the major attack groups that we do deal with. So hopefully none of your relatives are reflected there. I grabbed some of the stuff off the internet. The disgruntled employee, usually former employee, they're not that strong. They don't get very many repetitions of this. They don't get a lot of practice. Usually this is their first shot. They get ticked off and they go do something, and they're going to make mistakes ordinarily in comparison to the professionals. So they're just not as sophisticated. They don't have the same resources. Usually what they're doing is they're working with the equipment they've got at home, at work if they're still at work, or what they've been able to steal. But they don't have the financial backing that you're going to find with any of the other attack groups. They tend to have an overall smallest impact. When something happens, it cleans up easier. It tends not to have as much visibility. It's oftentimes kept within the family. Sometimes it gets publicized, but doesn't get outside the walls nearly as much as other stuff. Because they're not as practiced, they're usually easier to sort out. They usually leave behind a lot more clues, a lot more information than anybody else. So not too tough. Usually a shorter case requires a lot less time and effort. Okay, hacktivists, next step up. You hear about Anonymous, you hear about LulzSec. They are out there. They're doing this for a different reason. They're not just cheesed off at somebody. They're cause people. They're interested in making a point. They're interested in getting notoriety. They are people. There's some sort of mission. There's some sort of agenda. Sometimes political, sometimes not. But that's what motivates them, unlike the other groups. They are organized, but they're only loosely organized. You'll hear sometimes in the news reports that LulzSec made an announcement, but not all the members complied. And it seems like they have, they do. It depends on the individuals involved and how much they can get other individuals to follow them. So there is an organizational structure, but it's not nearly like the two groups after this that we'll talk about. They tend to be more, there's a range of skills. A few of their individuals are relatively sophisticated. Most of their people are not very, some of their people are actually still in high school. Some are in college, some are about the same age. There are others who are older, been doing it longer, but there's a pretty wide range in skills. Some of them are close to script kiddies, and just a small number will be more advanced. They use public available tools. These guys are not doing their own malware development. They're not buying malware for $50,000 a pop like the Russian organized crime folks would. These guys are using what's out there because they don't have the financial wherewithal to do more than that. Because they're not trying to make money off of this ordinarily. If they're going to break in, they're going to use common vulnerabilities. They're going to scan with Nessus. They're going to use open source code to scan your environment, look for web vulnerabilities, take what they can get. It's not too tough. And then overall, they are fairly disruptive. They can create a real problem for you as an organization, but they don't seem to have the same financial impact that the other more advanced groups would have. It isn't as widespread. It doesn't get you in as big a trouble. Okay, Eastern European organized crime. Think Russia, Romania, Estonia, Moldova, primarily. Those are areas of the world that they don't have they're looking for financial gain. They don't have the financial resources there, and there isn't such a law enforcement relationship that you can necessarily prosecute if they are found out. So they will operate from those, they're safe havens effectively, safe harbors. They do this for the money. This is all about the money. This is not about cause, this is not about notoriety. This is about making as much money as they can, and they make a lot of money. These guys are excellent bankers. They clearly have backgrounds in financial services. They know things about hardware infrastructure that a lot of their victim organizations, the banks, the payment processors, don't even know. HSM, hardware security module, is a piece of equipment where you store cryptograms and you use it to verify, generate, cancel out, recreate PIN numbers, and they know how to use this stuff better than most of the banks who have them installed. They tend to be Microsoft-centric. We have watched them bypass mainframes with all the information they wanted, AS400s, everything they wanted, and sometimes Unix systems. They're more likely to go after a Solaris box, maybe HPUX, but most of the time they won't. Most of the time they'll stay on Windows. They know it. That's what their tools are built for. And eventually that data they want is probably going to pass through a Windows system anyway, and that's why they don't have to do more. They're very automated. They automate everything. They're good at building tools. The Russians are they have a great educational infrastructure. They are good computer scientists. They're good application development people. They write some very creative code. Creativity, I would say, distinguishes this group from many others. They tend to, when they compromise a site, they tend to compromise more systems than they need to. If they need to compromise 3 systems to get all the credit cards in your institution, they'll do 12. If they need to compromise 6, they'll do 20. And the reason is because you need to make sure you're not interrupted. It's a best practice from a hacking standpoint. If somebody rebuilds a system on them, if somebody upgrades something that takes away their position, they need to be able to revert to another system and work unimpeded. Persistence is not a primary objective, meaning most of the time they don't come to live in your environment forever, unlike nation states. These guys come to get their money and then leave. However, if you interrupt them, they will come back and they will go counteroffensive and they will do whatever they can to actually get the money out, even while you know they're there. They can be very aggressive, so you have to be aware. Even when you think you kicked them out, if you leave a little bit of opening for them, they'll be back. I got a call one night. The guy said, "Have you ever seen them come back?" I asked him why he was asking me that question. He said, "Because we just had 1 million hits on our HSM 2 hours ago. It's going wild, and we don't know why." So they went dark, came off the internet, and they were back. Lately, what we've seen is increased stealthiness. We see them using alternate data streams in their malware so that it's harder to find. We see them turning off antivirus when they work on a machine, turning it back on. They're becoming more conscientious about cleaning up after themselves and making it difficult to determine what they did. Used to be they would leave RAR files because that's their encryption mechanism of choice. RAR files, whatever it is, they moved out of the environment and you could tell what they'd done. And now they're pretty good about making sure they don't leave any of that behind.
Seem to be moving up the payment processing scale too as they go. So instead of grabbing the low fruit at like your credit union down the road and hitting that website because it's susceptible to SQL injection and then getting credit cards, they seem to be moving up the processing chain to really get into the payment processors, beyond the banks, beyond the merchants, up into the processing. So I don't know if that's a product of boredom or that they've had so many years of getting all the low-hanging fruit that they felt like getting, or what. But
I think it's where the money is.
yeah, I think they're finding bigger dollars at those higher levels.
You can do more things. At a payment processor, you can do electronic funds transfers. You can get access to all the credit card embossing. Credit card embossing, those are the people who generate your credit cards. The banks buy from the payment processors. So there's a whole cache of millions of unissued credit card numbers that as soon as it gets issued, it gets active. And if you can own all that stuff and all the information associated with it, it kind of gives you a leg up. Plus all the electronic funds transfers, all the clearing that goes on, and a lot of the ATM management occurs at the payment processors, not really the banks. The banks outsource a lot of that. And these guys are good bankers, and they know that. Yes,
All
ma'am.
that said, there's still plenty of, of low-level crime going on in this regard. Like,
I was just wondering if they're actual Russians or are these other people from other countries working through Russia just to avoid.
You want to see some pictures? Okay, last thing is they're compromising larger numbers of systems. These are the Russians. Each of these people, the one on the upper left actually is in New York City. That's a restaurant in New York on his T-shirt. That's how they tracked him down. He should have been wearing a hoodie like everybody else does, so you couldn't see him.
Hoodie and money.
The other two guys, each were convicted. One did time served. They were both back on the street within 18 months. And coincidentally, totally coincidentally, the largest cash drawdown in U.S. history occurred 3 months after the second one had been released. Yes, they are Russians. And they always cover themselves with money and take pictures of themselves. No kidding. When we get the servers, we work a lot with law enforcement. There are other pictures as well. I referred to the underwear pictures. They always take pictures of themselves in underwear. And we don't, actually we know why. We have a Russian on staff for translation purposes. And they work in these old communist block apartment buildings. They're all cement. And the heating systems are bad in those. And it gets really hot in the winter. So they do their work in their underwear. I'm not making this stuff up. This is really the case. Okay, state sponsored. This is the big guys. These are the people who are better than anybody else. They do it for different reasons. This is not about notoriety. This is not about money. This isn't about intelligence. This is about taking the information from a more developed country and using it in my country so that I can make economic progress, that I can take and move my nation forward. I can bring my military system up to first world status, and I can do it more cost effectively because I'm not spending the R&D dollars. I can figure out what is going on. If you're going to do a merger, you're going to acquire a company in my country, I can figure out what you're willing to pay and what you're not willing to pay, and it makes my negotiations more effective, and I can save hundreds of millions of dollars on it. If things are in court, I can know what your approach is going to be strategically, and I can block that. I had one law firm say, it seemed like they always knew exactly where we were going to go in our case. No kidding. They've been known for a while. So these guys are highly motivated, tenacious. They will come into your network and they will stay. They will stay as long as there's value for them. And in places like defense industrial base companies where they're developing weapon systems, they stay forever, or they do their best. The next thing, these guys are more highly organized than any other group. This is, there are formal groups. They have a division of labor where there are certain groups who write malware. There are certain groups who break in. There are certain groups who move certain information. There are certain groups who do intelligence reviews. We've seen where after they take the information out of the environment, within hours or at most a couple of days, they've actually either grepped through all that information or done some sort of analysis of what they've taken, and then they've gone back for a strategic strike based on what the content was. And you can't be doing that if you're just a hacker pulling the information out and trying to move around these environments. It's different, real different. The last thing is their technology is better than everybody else's. It's not more creative than the Russians, but they've got version control on the malware. This stuff is heavily armored. They go through, they fix bugs, they've got comments about the versioning control, about what the enhancements are. I mean, this is a business. This is something that they are doing. This is not kicks and giggles here. This is a job. Yes, sir.
I just have a question on the malware that they create. Is it outsourced or is it in-house? I mean, it's actually a serious question. I mean.
Oh yeah, absolutely. They write it themselves. They may use. They may start with some open source like a Poison Ivy or something like that, and then they will upgrade it, weaponize it. Well, not weaponize it, but armor it.
We've seen a slight increase in them using more common available malware. I think for a while they were doing everything custom and they felt like it was leaving lots of fingerprints where they could be followed and tracked. So they seem to be moving a little bit back towards using common stuff when they can get away with it.
There's a bleed over between the financial, the Eastern European organized crime, and these guys, in that sometimes they're using the same tools now because the tools have gotten to the point where they're pretty darn good. And it's like a best practices thing. Hey, Poison Ivy, I can use this, I can get done what I need to get done. I don't have the same R&D, but if there's something special I want to do, they got the people to do it as well. These guys, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say, one of the big things that you'll notice with this group is that they definitely have different levels of sophistication. That we call them like the A team, the B team, the C team.
But there's 22 teams.
Yeah, but they'll definitely come at you with the lowest level they need to accomplish their goals. And then if you challenge them, or if they find out that they've been recognized, they up their game. And so that's somewhat as that tie between using the custom stuff versus the publicly available malware and attacks. So.
Okay. The last things about how these guys are different is they move more broadly than anybody else. When they compromise an environment, unlike the Eastern European organized crime, if they need to get to something on a few servers, they may compromise 600. Worst case scenario we've seen is 3,000. And after a while you go, what's the point? I mean, wasn't 2,000 enough? 1,500? But they do some pretty wild things. But if you are deployed through an environment as comprehensively as that, it is very, very difficult to remove them from the environment at any cost. And that's what we specialize in, removing these broad-scale, enterprise-wide intrusions.
And Steve's mentioned the word persistence a few times. It's in the fourth box, but it's a big principle in our business. So, the idea of being able to persist, whether it be reboots, a network reconfiguration, and so they want to spread out wide enough that no matter what happens, they still have a presence.
Second thing is, when you've got a breach of this magnitude, you need to get eyes on the network. You've got to have as complete network visibility as you can to what they're doing live, as close to live as you can get. And the second thing is, from a host standpoint, you have to figure out where they've been. Because if they've compromised 290 systems already and they're working on 10 now, if you're looking only at the network, you're never going to figure out about the 290. They will take and they will lay down malware that is different generation on a number of machines. And if you're going only from what you're seeing on the network, you'll never find that other stuff. You have to be able to look both ways.
This is one of, I'd put it on the list of maybe top 3 problems that corporations have, that companies have, that the government has, is being able to have this visibility that Steve just talked to is very difficult for these organizations. They're huge. So you'll go into a Fortune 100 company or Fortune 500 company, you're like, how many egress nodes do you have? So how many places do you have where your internal network is connected to the internet? And you get back a number like 1,200. Like, how the heck do you know what's coming in and what's going out if you have 1,200 spots? Well, how many countries are you in? 82. Like, how can you, it's overwhelming to them. How many hosts do you have? And sometimes you'll get back an answer that's, one day it's 20,000, the next day, we actually have 38,000. It's like, you were off by like 85%. They just have that little understanding of their networks because they're so big and complex. But it's something that they're really struggling with. I think across the board, these corporations are with trying to deal with this visibility issue. But without it, you're lost. You're lost before you even start the game. So.
Okay. And then the last thing associated with this group is, because of the complexity and the size, the amount of planning and coordination you need to put into remediation is exponentially higher with something like this. If you go and you remediate on 20 systems, they will understand what you're doing. Losing 20 systems that are beaconing all in about the same period of time, they know something's up, and they'll go and they'll pile drive into 50 more systems with different malware through a different egress point that you never knew was out there, and you haven't stopped them at all. Actually, you've just raised the stakes.
Remediation's all the actions you would take to get rid of the bad guy and then to keep them from coming back. So, and that's what Steve means. When you clean up 20 systems, but they had 100 compromised, you accomplish nothing, because those other 80 are there. They'll take over other systems, and they quite likely might increase their game up a notch to do even more sophisticated stuff than what they've been doing.
So anyway, those are the people. Those are the groups. That's who we deal with on a regular basis. Yes, ma'am.
So just a quick question. Looking at corporation, how much of what you've seen also relates to outsourcing? That's the first question. And second, what role do you think that cloud computing may play in all this? Because even the government is planning on close lots of data centers, and they want to move towards this. So what's your view?
We see some organizations compromised through their outsourced organizations. Many of the Fortune 500 outsource all their IT, their networks, their system administration, and more than a few times when we track down what the entry point was, what the attack vector was for a particular breach, we find it comes from their partner, sometimes an organization that they merged with or acquired that was compromised when that occurred, or sometimes who they outsourced to.
Cloud outsourcing is a really juicy target. right? So if I can get to the company that provides the email access for 30 other companies versus just hitting the one company, so there's a lot of target on those outsourcers.
So that's why I asked the question, because usually IT, it's one of the things that everybody's looking at cutting costs by outsourcing, and it seems to me that the reason that this practice persists is because they're not losing enough money, right? It's still productive for them to outsource, and then they'll have 1-2 incidents, but...
Yeah.
Well, but many of them don't know that they even have the problem until an investigation begins.
Sorry to interrupt. So the second question was about this cloud. Yes.
Well, the cloud is just another network, and the attackers, if they can get the attackers like the high ground. We have seen them compromise other organizations because they know those organizations have access into their targets. We've seen, for example, and this one wouldn't be immediately obvious, law firms. They attack law firms, and because the law firms tend to have not as much security as, say, a large defense industrial base corporation, and they also have aggregated all the information for their client in one directory. So you can go in, it's a softer target, all the information's already been aggregated for you, and boom, it comes out. So anything that's outsourced to me is just another network, and it needs to be secured the same way. And it's more problematic, I think, because of the way outsourcing, where the cloud works, where you have everybody commingled, or you have virtual environments.
Well, it gets even uglier from, you start thinking about mobile devices, and, the more you start moving away from the central infrastructure of the corporation to the cloud, to mobile devices, just the harder it is to secure.
Okay. We want to talk about just a few quick investigations. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, on the previous thread of conversation, how much business do you see, or how much do you pursue even of more preventative maintenance than remedial maintenance? And do you see a lot of people thinking that direction, or is mostly your job just to come in and clean up after it?
We have, in our service lines, incident response is the largest thing we do, but we have a proactive service offering. It's the same people. The people who help our clients defend, secure their environments are the same ones who investigate. The difference is we come to it with these are the things that the attackers are actually doing. So this is the place to invest your time. The problem, though, is this isn't about vulnerability identification and management. Most of the attack groups, especially with the nation states, they don't use vulnerabilities to get in. What they do is they do a phishing attack. The phishing attack, they get on a host, they get local admin credentials. They go from there to the domain controller. They dump PW dump on the domain controller. They move out all of the credentials, domain credentials, user passwords, service accounts, and they use valid credentials to move within the environment and move stuff out of there's no vulnerability involved. There are some good security practices that you can institute, and we'll talk about what some of those are at the end. But yeah, we consult with our organizations to prevent that type of thing. But the problem is that if you're really, really good, you can still get in.
That's really the big thing I was going to say to your question, was that we've seen a big shift. We've been saying for years that you have to get to a posture as a corporation or the government, or that you realize you can be compromised, and then what are you going to do about it? Instead of putting all your resources into build up the wall and don't let anyone in, you have to have some acceptance of the fact that you're going to get compromised.
If you have something worth taking.
And that's really where companies are moving. And I think most companies, large corporations, have accepted that now. They realize we have to live with this. We're in this world now. What are we going to do about it? And so that doesn't quite answer your question, but it puts a little bit of a spin on it. I think corporations realize now that they need to be prepared to spend money to deal with the fact that they're going to be compromised at times. And maybe, a continuum. Always compromised, just to what extent? It's that pervasive.
So sorry to interrupt, but I kind of like this direction. So you open the door for, if you're basically what you're saying, that even if you educate people, eventually you will have some way where they will get inside access. So you need to deal with insiders to some degree, right? You have to be. Once they have their normal credentials, the only way you can identify them is by tracing what they're doing, and some of those accesses may look legitimate.
Yes.
So my question is, do you see any limitations of existing tools in dealing with this problem? Because this is not right? An easy problem, and even differentiating what malicious behavior will be versus legitimate, it's not always a clean cut unless they really move the money and you see the result. It's something observable.
I think one of the biggest areas I noticed, a solution for enterprise-wide malicious attachment analysis would be really beneficial. I think the solutions that are out there currently aren't great. And it seems like every corporation that we go to and work with that's dealing with the nation state problem, they were compromised in one sense or another, probably through an email attachment or through links. And the question we always get is, what should we do about it? And there's a few solutions out there. I just don't think anyone's really brought the best solution possible to it. So I think that's a big limitation that the market's feeling.
Okay, case one, big conglomerate. This is a company every one of you knows. This is a very large multinational. And like most organizations who are compromised by the nation state, they got a call from law enforcement. The FBI called and said, we have some bad news for you. And they explained what they knew, and the company said, we need some help here. So we helped, and what we found was that the attack happened at least 3 years before the notification. The attacker had been in at least 3 years, but we lost all ability to track it because the logs didn't go any further back than that. That's as far as we could walk it back, because people don't necessarily retain sufficient detailed logs indefinitely. You just administratively, it's a problem. There were, so we could never determine the attack vector. In our opinion, 95+%, it was a phishing attack because that's what these guys do. Possible for something else? Yes. Likely? No. 93 systems compromised, all credentials lost, verifiable proof of credential loss. They were not always good at cleaning up what they did, so we could confirm that. The bad news was they didn't just have one attack group working at one time. They had 5 groups working concurrently. And what we find is sometimes they don't even have an awareness of the other attack groups. The attack groups are working somewhat autonomously, and it's like you've got 5 investigations. You can't, they're doing things differently, using different tools, different objectives, different time frames, and you have to treat it that way. The other bad news was that as we were going through, as far as actual data, sensitive data that left, the only thing we ever saw was incremental data movement. Email, files, what they would do is come in and say, give me everything since I was here last time. Give me everything since I was here last time. But as we walked it back, we never found the give me everything. So our assumption is at some point in time prior to 3 years ago, they got what they wanted, and they're just keeping persistence and making sure they don't miss anything going forward. That was bad news for this organization. We've ran into, from an administrative standpoint, an interesting limitation that we couldn't even investigate certain things because of international privacy laws. If you get over to Germany, if you get over to France, you'll find that they have some very stringent European Union privacy laws in general. They say, we're not comfortable with you looking at information from the United States or moving information offshore. So there are sometimes limitations, non-technical limitations, that prevent you from determining what you need to determine. In here, we were able to determine what they kept going after. R&D, manufacturing processes, interesting creations that were more efficient than were generally available in the market associated with green fuels. The last thing is we ran into another limitation similar to the privacy law stuff where the company had great difficulty investigating because they had outsourced their infrastructure to providers who said, well, yeah, I can allow you to investigate these systems, but you got to pay me $5 for every system that you want to install some initial investigative software on because that's my chargeback mechanism. And it became the cost associated with actually working with their infrastructure providers exceeded the cost of the investigation. Didn't expect that one.
The bad thing about this slide is I don't even know which customer this is.
Because there are so many that have a similar
this
story.
slide could apply to many, many, many cases that we're working
I'll whisper to you afterwards. Okay, the second one is a case of an illustration of how I think the Russians are more creative than anybody else. This is a financial systems, this is a financial breach, but it's different. And the picture here, usually you got bad guys and victims, but here there's another party involved. And the bad guys were working with affiliates. That's what they call them. It's like a partner. And the victims would actually go to the affiliate's website, and because of the arrangement between, basically a kickback situation between the hackers and these legitimate websites, I'll use the word a little bit loosely, that's how they were able to perpetrate this. So bad guys pay affiliates, affiliates let them do certain things on their websites, and people lose money to the bad guys. And it's called scareware because basically what they did was they scared the victims into giving them money. And the way it worked, and this is Mr. Scareware right here. Yes, another Russian. We've got his eyes covered because he's not in jail. We got a video. This is actually kind of an interesting thing here. When we were reviewing the server associated with this particular situation, we found a video of where they were, he's like a game show host. They were awarding their affiliates for being a good affiliate for the year. And they had the big, like a lottery thing. They had the big wheel and they had all the little balls in it. And what they did is the guy pulled it out and they awarded a brand new silver Mercedes to the affiliate of the year. And they panned over, and it was a shot like in a garage with like some really crummy curtains and everything. And they had their version of Vanna White with her gown, and she was doing the thing, you know, on the car. And it was a really sweet car, very high-end Mercedes. But he was in his white tuxedo. He's wearing a tuxedo there, and it was long tails, and it was the weirdest thing I've seen in a while. The way it all happened was people, the victims, were performing what I call ill-advised browsing. They were going to a website. So again, Russians, very, very creative people here. They said, we're going to take advantage of some people, and we're going to do it in such a way that they won't even report that they were taken advantage of. So we're going to go to porn sites, we're going to go to gambling sites, and we're going to, if somebody gets taken, they're less likely to raise their hand and say, I lost some money here. Probably won't even tell their family members. So what would happen is they would go to a site and there'd be an iframe pop-up, and it was actually on the affiliate's website. The iframe was associated with the attacker, the hacker, and it would say you're infected, you've got a virus. We can clean this for you. It'll cost you $69.99. And the thing was, if you didn't just shut your browser, anything you clicked, you could accept, you could deny. You know, it was going to install a rootkit. So that was the beginning of your bad day, is you now had a zombie machine that they could use any way they wanted in the future. And there's money in that for them to take, have your machine have a rootkit on it so I can use it later. Or maybe I can collect additional information, stick a key logger on it. But you had a problem. You were rooted. The other thing is they'd actually charge you. They'd say, here, if you want us to clean your system, give us your credit card number, and they would charge it right on through. $69.99, and it'd show up on your bill, and you paid it. So they're just taking money out of your pocket. And then they stole your credit card too. So they're getting you three ways, all at one time. It's like very creative people, these Russians. I mean, it wasn't just just one thing, but three for the price of one. They were so good at this that they would actually give you your money back if you complained, because they wanted to keep this under the radar. So when you downloaded it, you had a README, and it had installation instructions. It wasn't really doing anything, and it had an email for tech support and all that stuff. And if you complained, you actually got your money back. But that's helped them make sure that this was very rarely reported, in addition to the fact that they picked their websites, their affiliates, carefully. There are absolutely millions of victims. And when I say millions, I mean the affiliates made millions of dollars. So you can imagine what the actual hackers made. Tens of millions, maybe more. And you can't defend against this thing. It's user awareness. There isn't a technical solution to this. So all the good security in the world wouldn't defeat this. And it also doesn't get publicized, so it's how do you notify more people to avoid it? But interesting case overall. Yes, ma'am.
So because you said that nobody is notifying, how did you get to know about it? Law
Some people
enforcement,
complained.
or?
Some people complained. And one thing led to another. The law enforcement they've had a lot of success with this group in the last 6 to 8 months. There were a number of arrests made relatively recently, and law enforcement this is the type of thing they focus on, and we help. Last one, I alluded to this earlier. Largest cash drawdown in U.S. history. And this one I either had the good fortune or misfortune to be right in the middle of for about 3 months. Usually I don't do this. Usually they have somebody a lot smarter and better looking doing this than me. But it was a big one. And the CEO, our CEO and I were 2 of the initial 5 responders, which is, you're hurting for certain when you got that team going now, that's for sure. Again, this isn't something the victim organization identified. Rarely does that happen. Usually it's law enforcement indicating that they've got a problem. And what happened was over the weekend they got a phone call and they said something's going on, but it's a tip. We don't have any technical data. We don't have any information other than a tipster came in and said there's something going on. And we don't know other than it's involved with cards, but we don't know anything more about that. We don't even know what kind of cards it is. And what happened is over the weekend, bad things went down, and on Monday, that's when the victim organization started piecing it together. Piecing together the fact that they were now out $13 million that they had on Friday night when they closed the doors. They started doing some balancing, and the numbers were not adding up. They didn't have the same amount of cash on hand. What happened was the attacker got in. This is one case where they did use a non-Microsoft entry point. They used a JBoss application on a Unix system that was, it wasn't under regular patch management. It wasn't centrally maintained. It was maintained by a small group off on the side, and it wasn't maintained very well. And they went from there. They hopped across the environment. The attacker was there for a couple of months before doing anything. And when they did, during the course of that, they either accessed or compromised 360 systems within the environment. And that included many systems that had access to payment card data. Nothing associated with electronic funds transfer, but a lot of stuff associated with prepaid debit cards. They used remote desktop. They found a user acceptance test system that connected to the back-end database associated with the debit cards. And they found a particular program that didn't have fraud protection on it because they're good bankers and they understand what that looks like. And they proceeded to draw down across 2,300 ATMs in a 48-hour period with approximately 350 individuals moving from ATM to ATM across a number of different countries. And they got about 13 million. It's a good night's work. And the way they do this, they have so many people involved. You know, hey, I'm going to take a little extra for myself. Maybe I withdrew $1,000. I'm going to tell them 500 and keep the rest for myself. No, that isn't going to work. These guys actually, they're monitoring the database during the entire time. They see every transaction, they record it, they know right to the penny everything that you should have. So if you show up with less money in your duffel bag than you're supposed to, they kill you. So this is all about the money. This is very mechanized. These are professionals. They got pins. They figured out that there was a web service associated with a voice recognition system. If you were calling up, you forgot your PIN number, you could have it. You could give the appropriate information, and you can get a PIN sent to you. They figured it out. They figured out that they could manipulate that, and they got the PIN numbers for the cards they wanted, and they started the drawdown. They'd set an account. You might have a prepaid debit card that had $100 on it. They'd set it to 5 million, and then they just have people draw down on it. You can have as many ATMs drawing down on a single balance as you want. There's nothing that prevents that from happening. And because they're good bankers, they know that. The attacker remained in the environment. We showed up, and for the first month there was no activity. And then they came back in. And we had a really bad weekend where they were going to try to get more money drawn down. They were unsuccessful. The bank, actually it's not a bank, the client had instituted fraud protection and a whole bunch more monitoring. And of course, we were all up for about 48 hours that weekend, about 50 people, but they didn't get anything else. But that was an unpleasant time. The scary thing for me is they're in the environment for such a long period of time and they never went after anything other than this. And if I were them, I would have gone after a lot of other things. We never found any evidence that that was the case. And we got a pretty good look. So I feel pretty good about that conclusion, but I still don't understand it. Okay, so how we do this stuff. And I got like 2 minutes. All right, this is going to be really quick here. Whenever we show up, we need the background. We need to know what happened or what they think happened. We need to get everybody in a room, and everybody tells the story. What have you done? What haven't you done? What have you got? What's your technical environment look like? And then we start piecing it together. And it's usually no two people have exactly the same story. There's a lot of evidence collection that goes on. Sometimes we're not starting with very much. Sometimes it's just a server or two, a workstation or two. But you work the evidence. You work back from whatever you've got. One of those steps early on is you need to increase the monitoring. Whatever they're doing is not enough. It doesn't matter who it is. It's not enough. It needs to go back further. You need to retain the detail. You can't let it go. You got to amp it all up, and we've got a whole series of recommendations for doing that. Then it's old school. Forensic analysis, malware analysis, log analysis, and you iterate your way through it. What we're trying to do is identify what is indicative of the attacker being here. And then once we understand what we're looking for, we can look for it more broadly. What we're trying to do is identify attack vector, timeline, extent of compromise. How broad is this thing and what they take? It's hard. It's easy to say. It's hard to do. And the last thing is when you write this stuff up, it may be law enforcement's going to see it, regulatory bodies, the SEC, the payment card industry. There may be agencies in the federal government that are interested in it. There could be a lot of lawyers who want to look at it. And they may be looking at it for the next few years, depending on how the lawsuits go down. So you need to make sure writing is not a casual thing. We write facts. We don't speculate. It's what we saw, not what we think we saw. I mentioned earlier that there are a whole series of things that we recommend for people to take action and defend their environments better. First, you got to start with what is it they're doing and take it away, whatever it is. And there's a whole bunch of different ways to take it away, and it really depends on the individual situation. But you can institute a whole bunch of things, but if it doesn't have anything to do with what the attacker's doing, it's not worth it. Doesn't get you anything. Okay. What do we do? Why do we do this? Do we get something out of it? We learn some really cool tricks from the bad guys. We get a chance to work with intelligence agencies, law enforcement. It's cool stuff. I'm interested at cocktail parties for the first time in my life. It is like amazing. We learn how to investigate things. We learn how to chase the bad guys, from our standpoint. They think they're the good guys. We think they're the bad guys. It's cool. We get a chance to work with law enforcement all around the globe, not only in the US, but elsewhere. We learn interesting things like international privacy law, things I never thought I would need to know before, and the ramifications of it. And we find out that sometimes big companies work well and sometimes they don't. Sometimes the organizations they outsource to have their issues and challenges, and it makes our life sometimes a little more difficult. But that's what we do for a living.
Any questions?
Question. In the very beginning, you mentioned the F-35 weapons system. When they look at something that complex and that large, how did they? Where they can't just go over the wire and steel prints. They need ongoing process information, manuals, emails. Do they get that comprehensive when they take this stuff?
Yeah, although it's staged. I mean, I don't think that you come in and see one point where they steal all that. But I mean, from drawings to emails to everything you can think of.
Enough that they can.
As an organization, you're fully exposed, so it's just a matter of them taking what they think's useful.
In the case where the large drawdown, the 13 million of cash, before they got on the user acceptance testing box, they located the system admins for the database, and they learned what all the custom development was. They did 2 months of reconnaissance, information gathering, and they developed their approach. And you could see them doing test transactions to make sure I can actually execute a SQL query. Good, great. Reset back to the amount it was, and then go off and do their other work.
We sort of jest a little that, at the government, the defense industrial base type level, that we're hoping that these other countries have enough information that they're just confused. Because we know they've had unlimited access to a whole heck of a lot of information. So my only hope is that it's overflow at this point, because it's a lot that's gone out the door.
I have a question on the fact that how companies approach you. Do you see the trend right now being more?
I think you need to use that marks, please.
I'm sorry. Do you see the companies being more precautionary rather than reactionary now?
Precautionary? They never know what's happening.
No, because most of them do not invest in security because of the amount of money it costs them. So now, if they were to prevent the whole process a priori to then.
Some people get it. It depends on whether they see themselves in the attacks. When somebody says, that could have been me, that's when they'll take action. Or if they say, that was me, they'll take action. I find that different industries react differently. The defense industrial base, they get it. If they're of any size, they're very aware of this. There's a lot of communication back and forth, and they're doing probably the best of anybody out there as far as defending their infrastructure. I was at a law firm on Monday, and they talked about the fact that they've been notified several times by the FBI, and they know they haven't taken care of the problem. And so they asked me to come back to talk to their senior partners. Maybe you can talk them into it. Maybe you can scare them, tell them something, because we've told them all this stuff. I described the attack, and the guy came up to me afterwards, the CIO, and he said, you described what happened to us. And we didn't even know. We were just walking in there, asking us to talk to them, and we told their story without knowing that we were telling their story. That's because it's the same story every time. It's easy.
Question. Is there, it seems like you've been mentioning some preventive measures in the sense like, what do you think is more impactful? Educating, I guess, enhancing policy, increasing security, or I guess maybe better regulating or enhancing our laws?
Yeah, I don't see actually regulations being that effective. Usually regulations have to be very broadly stated. And I find, for example, the $13 million drawdown, they were PCI compliant. That was the first report I read. And they said, oh, yeah, except we didn't encrypt any of our data in the database. Here's our compensating control for that. Signed off. Well, regulation, you can't just, the regulation won't be sufficient. Policy, important, yes, so that people know what to do. But execution, more important than policy. And effective execution. Not let's go do best practices. I think you have to understand what the threats are, what the attack groups tend to capitalize on. And if you can do that well, you get the best value for your expenditure. But not everybody can spend the money either. It's kind of that, what can we afford to do?
So how about better educating people?
That is something that is valuable. It's not sufficient, but it's a key step.
Do you find that in a lot of these organizations, the network admins are not sufficiently well trained in security?
Absolutely. Usually they get drawn into the event, but we find even in very large organizations, the security teams are pretty darn small. The only time they get big is when you've got some sort of event like this. When this big one I keep alluding to because it's burned into my mind, is as we were writing the report, the guy in charge of the security area said, make sure one of your recommendations is to add lots of staff because this is my time to take advantage. I want every piece of gear you can possibly recommend it. Everything. He said the bank is open for me. So pile right in. But if you don't have that type of event, security is the type of thing, if you don't ever have an issue, then you're spending too much money on it, whatever you're spending. So it's you can't pick the right level, you don't know.
So maybe we can stop.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.